just feel compelled to look at in Philippians. And it's at the very end of the letter, and it's Philippians 4:10 through 13. At this stage in the letter, he's giving some practical exhortations, but of course he's done that throughout. But here, because this is such an important topic, I feel like it's worth discussing rather than just moving on to Colossians, which we could have done. So let's read this together. Philippians 4:10 through 13. I rejoiced in the Lord greatly now at length you have revived your concern for me. You were indeed concerned for me, but you had no opportunity. Not that I'm speaking of being in need, for I've learned in whatever situation I am to be content. Very quickly, verse 11, remember the situation he's in. And as I stated in the very first class, I think the situation he's in is a Roman prison and not house arrest in Rome. I think he's in a real Roman prison, which, as I said, is not the place to be. It's not where you want to find yourself. It's a terrible situation. And yet, he's able to say, I'm not in need. I've learned in whatever situation I'm in to be content. I know how to be brought low. I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I've learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. What a mindset, right? How can you be content in those situations? And he admits, you know what? I've had some really good times. I've had some really bad times. And he says, I'm content in both of those. Both of those extremes and everything in between, I'm content. How is that? Verse 13. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. That's how you do it. So let's talk about this a little bit, because of course we live in a society that is not very content generally as individuals. There are a lot of reasons for that. Some reasons have to do with the kind of economy that we have. Some of it has to do with the nature of competition that's so prevalent in our society, and many other factors. So this is a real challenge to each and every one of us. And it doesn't even have to necessarily be financial contentment. It can also be contentment in our successes and our achievements. I mean, how often do we find ourselves as adults saying to young people, you can achieve whatever you want to achieve? Which, of course, is ridiculous. But besides that, we do give that impression. You could achieve whatever you want. So that's our society. There are other factors at work. But he says, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. So, how is Jesus the solution to being content? Can somebody expound upon this a little bit more? How is Jesus the solution to contentment? Nobody knows?
Well, in the context, he's talking about learning to accept your situation.
Okay. But how is Jesus the solution in accepting your situation?
I would say that seeing what Jesus went through, not having anything, being ridiculed, being crucified ultimately, and seeing how he laid his life down, I would argue that Paul is saying, look what he's done. I haven't gone that low yet. Jesus has. So if I have just a little bit less or a little bit more than what Jesus had, I should be content.
Okay. Yeah, that's one way to view it for sure. Look at what Jesus went through. Yeah.
Because of what Jesus did, no matter what we're going through, we have something better to report.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And even though there's so many spiritual blessings, that's the one that has sort of the longest lasting implications, right? So yeah, of course, whatever it is, it's only temporary. I mean, we live such a short time, even if we have difficult lives. And I know that some people in this room, when looking back on your life, you may say, I've had a difficult life. I understand that, and I'm not belittling that at all. But I am saying that contentment can be found, even in difficult circumstances, namely, like you said, because Jesus went through it and because Jesus provides hope, which is going to provide us with the most contentment you could ever want. Contentment's probably not even strong enough for the joy that we'll experience in that life, right? But there's something else here, and this may sound a bit metaphysical, but it's actually a pretty good segue to Colossians. We're not quite ready to go there because I'm wondering if somebody else may have something to add, but Jesus is the solution to all the problems. Jesus is the solution to contentment. Jesus is the solution to my unhappiness. Jesus, it's everything, right? So that's a bit of an easy answer maybe to say Jesus, but it is the answer because that's what he says in verse 13. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. So, what is the problem? Okay, contentment in low situations, difficult situations, that's a good question. How do we become content when things aren't going so well? But what about when things are going well? You would think those are the times at which we would be most content, and yet he clearly says, nope, that can be a problem too. What can lead to a lack of contentment when things are going really well? Yeah.
Well, when things are going good, your whole mindset shifts. So it really changes your perspective. And so when you have something that you think is fulfilled, it just never becomes enough. And
Okay.
I don't really know how to answer that other than it's just psychological. I don't know if there's like a better answer than that. And then with Jesus, he gives us something that is attainable through him, but he gives us a perfect mark to aim from for something that we daily have to try to fulfill. It's a very fulfilling thing to try to live the life of a Christian. It's a very purpose-filled life.
Yeah, it is. But it can also become frustrating sometimes, right? Because you said it's a perfect mark, and of course it is, right? But we are going to fall short. Sometimes that can be frustrating. But I think you make another really good point, and Paul says this back in chapter 3. Has he attained this goal of the resurrection of Jesus? He says, no, I haven't attained it yet. Even Paul says that. So, yes, he's saying be content. But is he content with his own spiritual growth? In other words, does he get to the point where Paul says, you know what, I'm good enough? No. Right? So this isn't absolute in the sense of I'm content with my own spirituality. That's a different kind of pursuit. I think what he's saying is, he's saying with the everyday circumstances of life, whether good or bad, I can be content in those. Anything else somebody like to add to this? Yeah. Yep.
That's a difficult battle whenever we may be financially at ease. Maybe spiritual things may be a little harder to achieve.
Yeah, exactly. And I think in this country, with all the blessings that we have, maybe we're more susceptible to that. It's hard to think about that with the last year and everything that's happened, but even still, even with that, we are so much better off than so many other places in the world. And so it is easy to become content in that respect, but on the other hand, not be so content. We say, all right, let's talk about financial contentment. We're financially content, and we say, well, you know what? Things are great now. But what if I made a little bit more money? Think about how much better they would be then. Think about how great that would be. Yeah.
I think the key word here is security. Where do we find security?
Okay.
Is it in physical things? Is it in our job? Is it in our success? Or is it in the hope that we have in Christ?
Yep.
That's what makes us truly content.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a great point. Security is the key word. And you mentioned financial success as security, and that's typically how we talk about security, I think, but there's so many other things like you alluded to. We can be secure in ourselves, where we are in life in terms of achievement. And our society, by the way, normally, and you know this, our society normally equates financial success with achievement, although that's not necessarily the case. People can be very successful and not necessarily have the most money, but often they do go they do go hand in hand. All right, well, as usual with a passage like this, I feel like I haven't done a very good job. I don't feel very content in my ability to get this across. Anybody else have something before we move on? Yeah.
Paul's already talked to God about it when he prayed for that thorn in the flesh to go away.
Okay.
And the answer was, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness.
Okay.
Even in a bad situation, there's an opportunity to glorify God in it.
Okay, very good. And you mentioned 2 Corinthians. He says, I have learned the secret. This isn't something he knew at all times in his life. It's a learning process. 2 Corinthians, there are some passages, not just there, that's the most well-known one, but in 2 Corinthians 11. But read 2 Corinthians chapter 1. In 2 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul is in a difficult situation, or was in a difficult situation. So this is something that Paul had to learn. And, of course, we look at Paul as this super Christian. Well, he is somebody to emulate, and he experienced things, and he did things that are certainly commendable. But he wasn't perfect. He had to learn these things just as we do. Yeah.
Well, you said, I was just going to say, it's something to learn.
Yeah.
It's not our natural state just
Yeah.
to be where we're at. It's a process.
And, yeah, exactly. And that's how so many Christian concepts are, right? They are so paradoxical to how we normally think about things, how we normally think about things. And that's the challenge of Jesus. And so if we ever get to the point where Jesus isn't challenging, we're doing something wrong. It's not that he's, gotten so easy or his words are so easy to follow. No, we're not doing something right. Because I think at every turn, I'm not exaggerating, there ought to be a challenge on a daily basis on, how do we apply the principles, these great principles that we have in Scripture. All right, anything else? Oh, sorry.
I think you talked about contentment has to do with your perspective, and Christ gives you that perspective that whether good things are happening, you have a perspective of, these things are coming from God.
Yeah.
When things are bad, the perspective is, that God's going to get you through this. This is not eternal, and that's kind of that change of perspective is an eternal one. That the things of this life are not eternal. The things of God are eternal.
Okay, yeah. A very good point is the perspective dictates our response. And think about when difficult things happen. A lot of times people ask the question, why? Even people of faith, even Christians ask why. And you know what? I think that's okay. We have people in the Bible asking why. The psalmist, Jeremiah, Ecclesiastes, asking why. But you know what? And of course, I left out maybe the most explicit one, and that's Job. But you know what happens at the end of Job? When God finally is there to answer the question of why. What does he say? Does he give us the answer why? No, he says you can't understand it. Be quiet, is essentially what he says. We may not like that. That's what he says. So the answer to the question why, we're not going to get it. We're not going to understand it. People have been trying to figure this out for thousands of years. No one's got it cornered. And it's not going to happen. So instead of asking why, our perspective dictates that even in these difficult circumstances, we can't answer the question why, but we can become a better person on the other side of it. That is something we can control. That is something we can know, right? So again, it has to do with perspective. Yeah, excellent point. I think that's a good one to end on, unless somebody else has just got something wonderful to add, which you probably do, right?
Well, I think that God gives us a sound mind.
Yep.
And that sound mind, we go to Him in prayer and believe that what we pray for with our sound mind, that we're not praying amiss for things that are not what He would see fitting for us.
Okay.
That we have that trust that after we pray, He will give us the strength to endure anything.
Yeah, exactly. And there are several passages we could put with this one to reflect that idea. Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. All right, I'm moving on now. Unless somebody's just got something earth-shattering. No earth-shattering comments. All right, no, we had some very good ones. Okay, so ultimately, this contentment idea has to do with the fact that Jesus is superior, and that is the theme, really the theme of Colossians. And we'll talk about that in more detail here in just a minute. In terms of the question specifically with having to do with Colossians, what is Jesus superior to, which is the real question surrounding Colossians. Before we get into that, I'm a little hesitant to do this, but I'm going to do it anyway. And there could be a case made for not even talking about this in a church Bible class. And maybe somebody here disagrees with my idea to do this. That's okay. That's fine. Maybe it's a mistake. I don't think it is. Obviously, I wouldn't do it if I thought it was a mistake. What am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about the authorship of Colossians. Some scholars doubt the authenticity of some Pauline epistles, including Colossians. My rationale for talking about this is you may hear about this in other avenues. So why don't we just talk about it now with this opportunity very quickly and move on? Because I think sometimes we do a disservice to ourselves when we never talk about this. And the only people talking about this are critics of the Bible. Well, why shouldn't we talk about it? Okay, should we spend the entire class on it? No, of course not. But I do think it's a good idea to bring it up. Because these scholars question the authenticity of Pauline epistles. Some of them, and so you may say, well, their motivations are pretty transparent. They're trying to disprove the validity of the Bible. That's what some of them are doing, for sure. Not all of them. So Colossians is one of them. Ephesians is another. The pastoral epistles and 2 Thessalonians, those are usually the ones that are debated. 2 Corinthians, not so much really, but those are the ones. So Colossians is included. Colossians is probably more questionable than some of the others among critical scholars. Why do they do this? Well, it's based on the assumption that we take authentic Pauline epistles that no one disagrees about, like Romans or 1 Corinthians and Galatians. We have authentic Pauline texts. We compare Colossians, we compare Ephesians, and they don't quite match it in terms of, we'll just talk about style, but also content. And I got to tell you, the style, you can see this in English. Read Ephesians, read the syntax of Ephesians, and then read 1 Corinthians. It's different. You can see it in translation. We need to be honest about that. But the assumption that we know exactly what the Pauline letters should look like on the basis of Galatians and 1 Corinthians is an unwarranted assumption. That's building an assumption upon something we can't know. So this is not about, well, I'm a believer and I want to believe that the Bible is true. We're not even going there yet. This is from a critical, logical perspective. And by the way, this isn't just me who thinks this, right? This isn't just some crazy idea I've come up with. No, this is what several scholars think. So it has to do, the solution, by the way, to this problem, and this is my only point in bringing this up. The solution to the problem is the notion that Paul used secretaries, which the New Testament is explicit about in Romans 16:22. I, Tertius, the writer of the letter. Now wait a minute, I thought Paul wrote Romans. Well, he did, but Tertius had something to do with it. So these secretaries are writing down what somebody like Paul is saying. And this is a practice in the Greco-Roman world for other letter writers as well. So the question is, did Paul use a different secretary for Colossians? Because the secretary isn't mentioned. That's very possible. Did Timothy have something to do with how the letter comes together? That's possible too, because in Philippians, Philemon, and Colossians, Timothy's mentioned at the very beginning. Okay, now, maybe the question is, what about inspiration? Well, why couldn't God inspire these men to work together to produce this inspired text? I don't see any problem with that. Okay, so that doesn't do anything to inspiration. So, my only point is, I think it's the questioning of an epistle like Colossians as being authentically Pauline is based on a false assumption. So, in other words, it's not a problem, I don't think. Any questions about this? Yeah.
Was the authorship of Colossians questioned in the early church?
No. No. In fact, 1800s is when it became a question. Yeah, right. Critical German scholarship began this question. That's a good point. That I think is something to pay attention to as well, because those guys are careful readers of the text, and they do question some things, but not Colossians. Any other questions? Is this clear? And by the way, if you think this is a bad idea, please let me know afterward. If you didn't think I should, if you thought, well, why did he bring this up? Let me know. It's fine. I may disagree, but no, it's fine. All right, so let's talk about the letter now. Let's get past that. So let's talk about Colossae. Colossae was at one time a great city, but at the time of the New Testament it was greatly reduced. This is also something worth noting, that a lot of times, for example, in Acts 17, when Paul goes to Athens, well, what was Athens like in the 1st century versus Athens in the 4th century BC? A very different place. So these cities change. And a lot of times, especially when the Romans come in, a lot of times they destroyed these cities, they rebuilt them. We talked about that with Philippi, right? Well, Colossae suffered a similar fate. Part of the reason for Colossae not being such an important city anymore is because of the success of Laodicea and Hierapolis. So let me see if I can mess this up. No, there we go. It's right here in Asia Minor. Notice Ephesus is not that far away. Let's look at a closer map here so you can see how close Laodicea and Hierapolis are. And so it's just here in the Lycus Valley, and it's just no comparison. However, you think there was a lot of traffic coming and going? You got 3 cities here, 2 major cities, and in Colossae, not so much. You think people were coming and going? Yeah, they were coming and going. So that ought to tell us something about the religious climate of Colossae, which we'll say much more about. Now, this is really surprising here, but the picture on the right. But let me say this first. It's destroyed by an earthquake in 60 to 61, so that complicates things a little bit. Since then, it's never rebuilt, and it's never been excavated. Can you believe that? Such an important city, not just for New Testament studies, it's an important city for classical studies too. We could learn something about the classical world, the Greco-Roman world, by excavating Colossae. Never been touched. Why? Anybody think of why it wouldn't have been excavated? If you had to guess? Politics and money. That's it. That's pretty much it. I do know of some efforts a few years ago where some New Testament scholars tried to get together and excavate it, and to my knowledge, nothing ever came of it. And what's really aggravating about it is if we could excavate it, it might answer some questions we have about the text. But we can't do that yet. Maybe one day. Maybe one day. It's just so surprising that with the money that would be available to do it, it would be there. The politics, I think, hold it back. All right? Oh, okay. So enough of complaining on my part about that. There was a Jewish population there, maybe thousands of Jews. Josephus says that, I think he says 2,000 families. He says this in Antiquities, 2,000 families settled there. So that's important to remember as we read the letter, because certain Jewish elements are mentioned at Colossae. All right? So what is the occasion for the letter? Why did Paul write Colossians? And this is an important question because We need to remember that the New Testament epistles are written for us, but they weren't written to us. They're written on an ad hoc basis. Anybody know what that means? Ad hoc? Anybody know? Any Latin scholars in here? Ad hoc means for a specific purpose, for a specific occasion. So that's why we ask this question. Why was Colossians written? Because it's not like Paul woke up one day and he said, you know what? I'm going to write a letter to the Colossians. Yeah, we're going to talk about the supremacy of Jesus. Yeah, let's do that. No. Letter writing is too complicated and too expensive, and it took too long to get to the destination. It had to be a good reason to write. And by the way, that's a reminder for all New Testament epistles. I mean, something like Romans, that is so magnificent in so many ways. It's written for a specific purpose. It's not like Paul woke up and said, you know what, I'm going to write the best treatise on justification by faith ever written. He didn't do that. It's because the Romans had an issue and Paul needed to handle it, just like in Colossae. All right, so what is it? Well, the supremacy of Christ was being questioned. Can you believe that? The supremacy of Christ was being questioned. Does that sound familiar? Yep, you bet it does. So already, haven't even started the letter, already we can see this is important. This is applicable for us today in a world where so few even contemplate the supremacy of Jesus. So, what is this supremacy, this question of this supremacy at Colossae? This is called, by scholars, the Colossian heresy. The nature of it is very much debated. In other words, who exactly was this group? And I'll just go ahead and tell you, nobody knows. Nobody knows for sure. What happens in a case like this, and there are other cases in antiquity where you'll have a writing that mentions a group of people, and it may mention them by name, it may not. And so what scholars try to do is they look at these characteristics and they try to find contemporary sources which are either written from the perspective of the opponents or written by somebody else who also talks about the opponents. And you can match them up and you can come to the conclusion or come to a better conclusion about certain specifics. You can't do that with the groups here because we don't know, because we don't know who he's talking about. Another analogous case is Philo of Alexandria. He writes this work called talking about the Therapeutae. Well, who's that? Nobody knows. It doesn't conform to any group we know about. In fact, some people think Philo made it up. Anyway, that's not what people think here, but they do wonder, what is he talking about? All right, so before we get to the possibilities, let's look at what the text itself says. All right, so I know this is a lot of text, but what I have underlined are descriptions of the opposing group, the heretical group. Okay, so it's called a philosophy, by philosophy. And he says, according to human tradition. I could have underlined that too. And then he says, according to the elemental spirits of the world. What's that? We'll talk about that later. But that's an important part of what you have in Colossians. Okay? Not according to Christ. And then he says, all the fullness of deity. All right? Again, maybe that has something to do with it. Then verse 16, therefore let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food or drink or with regard to a festival, new moon, or Sabbath. What does that sound like? Jewish. Yeah, exactly. So we know, at least in part, it's Jewish. All right? That much we can say. Let no one disqualify you, insisting on asceticism. What's asceticism? Anybody know? Anybody know what asceticism is? Yeah. I'm sorry, I cut you off. What did you say at the end?
Very restrictive discipline type of law.
Yeah. Discipline type of life, very strict. This includes denying yourself of pleasure, but it also sometimes denies yourself of necessity, right? Maybe one of the most famous cases of extreme asceticism is the Buddha, who, according to Buddhist sources, for several days, he only had 1 grain of rice and 1 cup of water. That's all he had every day. I mean, we can wonder whether that's actually true, but it's beside the point. That's extreme asceticism, right? So, we're talking about people who denied themselves of certain things. Okay, that's asceticism. And then we have one of the most difficult phrases here, the worship of angels. And I don't want to get too far into this because we will when we get to chapter 2. But the worship of angels here sounds like they are actually worshiping angels. Are there any Jewish groups we know of in antiquity who worshiped angels? No. There are none that explicitly worship angels. That's a problem. And again, we'll get to that. Okay? So, worship of angels, going on in detail about visions puffed up without reason by his sensuous mind. Somebody earlier brought up 2 Corinthians 11. I think in 2 Corinthians 11, when Paul's talking about that visionary experience, whatever he's doing exactly, I think he's countering the opponents there who were bragging about their visions. Well, that's what these people are doing here. Why would people with visions be puffed up? And he says, without reason, by a sensuous mind, a fleshly mind. Why would they be bragging about visions, do you think? Anybody know why visionary experiences would lead to some sort of arrogance? Yeah. Yeah, that's it, exactly. I've had visions. You haven't had them? I've got knowledge you don't have. Right? That's exactly right. Verse 21, do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. Again, we could say that has to do with Jewish regulations. And then he says, verse 23, these have indeed an appearance of wisdom in promoting self-made religion, asceticism, and severity of the body or to the body. Okay, so that is pretty much everything we have from the text. There are other, I think, indirect references to it, but that's what we can say for sure. So when we put all that together, what is it? That's the real question. One scholar did something very interesting here, and he put these ideas in the form of a letter that this heretical group could have written or communicated, maybe not in a letter, but communicated to the Colossians. And I think it's pretty much spot on. It's like this. And again, this is just his reconstruction of what we just read. Dear Colossians, we know you're experiencing hardships. No doubt you are, I've left that out. You are aware that there are evil spirits and powers that have authority over our mortal world. These powers prey on the weaknesses of human bodies and flesh. Thus, our world is fraught with cosmic chaos. We can offer, though, knowledge, wisdom, and teachings that can protect you from the malevolent forces. By controlling, combating, and disciplining your own frail body, you can resist these powers. Circumcision and strict ritual Torah observance are particularly effective in counteracting these hostile spirits. Once you've submitted yourself to such disciplines of the body, you will gain access to the celestial world, receiving divine wisdom, visions, provisions to fight against the weakness of the flesh that the evil powers use against you. We can offer you the proper route to spiritual fullness and perfection. I think this really works well, and it puts the ideas together in a logical fashion that sounds very much familiar to some other groups, okay? It doesn't solve the problem of exactly which group it is, but I think this really helps get at what the message was. Now, the question is, did this actually infiltrate the Colossian church? Because Paul's tone is not like it is in Galatians, certainly. So there is a question, is this some sort of competition? And one scholar said maybe this was like and he referred to it as the synagogue across the road, and this is what they were teaching, and some Colossians were saying, that's interesting. Maybe. I don't know for sure. But anyway, I think this is an interesting reconstruction of what's going on. All right, so I think I don't have a problem with anything he says here. So how do we categorize this group? Well, some scholars have said this is pre-Gnostic syncretism. Syncretism means a blending together of several different beliefs. It's often used in world religions, and I think it's probably more appropriate used in world religions. So, for example, if you're somebody living in China, you could be a Buddhist, but you could also still be a Taoist at the same time, and you could practice Confucian ethics. You could implement 3 different parts of different religions. We would say that's strange, but that's syncretism. Okay, so this would be pre-Gnostic because it's too early to be Gnosticism. Gnosticism doesn't show up fully until the 2nd century. So anytime you talk about Gnosticism in the New Testament, I think we have to be careful because I think it's anachronistic. So I don't really think that's a legitimate contender. An unknown Jewish sect, that's not very helpful, but that may very well be what it is. Some sort of Jewish Gnosticism, a Christian Gnosticism, I don't know. There's no doubt that some of the things they say sound like later Gnosticism. But again, the problem is Gnosticism doesn't clearly come on the scene until late the 1st century into the 2nd century. So I'm a little hesitant to say this. So all that discussion and finally to say, not sure. It's clearly a Jewish group, but they also have certain elements borrowed from the Hellenistic world and maybe something that would later evolve into Gnosticism. And we'll unpack some of that later as we go along. Any questions? I know this is maybe a little bit difficult, but any questions about this? Okay, good question. And I actually almost brought that up, and I should have, obviously. Gnosticism is a group, again, late 1st century, 2nd century is when they really become popular. They were a group who basically combined Christianity, aspects of Judaism, with Platonist philosophy to the extreme. And so they believed, for example, that God who created the universe wasn't Yahweh. The God who created the universe messed things up. And you might say, well, why would they believe that? Well, that's a solution to the problem of evil, right? Because if they can blame it on some God who really didn't know what he was doing, that relieves Yahweh. But of course, that compromises monotheism. So that's another huge problem. But for the Gnostics, that wasn't such a problem. The other thing about Gnosticism is the goal is not salvation from sin. The goal is knowledge, thus freeing the soul from ignorance. And they have this huge myth associated with the souls and the return back to God. I mean, some of it's really weird, to be honest with you. So that, just in a nutshell, that's a very good question, and I should have brought that up. So there's no, in Colossians, there's nothing that's nearly that developed, but some of it does kind of sound that way. All right. Any other questions about this? Okay. Let's look at the structure. And the structure of Colossians is pretty easy, I think. We have another hymn to Christ in chapter 1, so that's something to get excited about again because it's sort of like the hymn in Philippians 2, but it also says some things that Philippians 2 doesn't. And by the way, it may also be another piece of a hymn, like we said Philippians 2 was. That takes us through chapter 2 of verse 5, and then the theme of the letter, 2:6 to 4:6, superiority of Christ, and then what that means in terms of how you should live, and then you have the concluding remarks in 4:7 through 18. This is maybe the most practical takeaway from this introduction. This is what Knight said in his commentary in Colossians. This is a recent commentary. It came out in 2018. He says, God has conquered the powers, delivered all humans from sin and its powers, and reconciled the entire cosmos to himself in, through, and under Christ. The central aspect of the religious significance of Colossians is that it occurs a vision of human victory in the face of an evil that can reach cosmic proportions. I want to start with that again next Wednesday, but I think that's, again, maybe the most practical thing that I've said tonight about Colossians. All right, we'll start the letter next Wednesday. Thank you.